Welcome everyone to our first webinar of our series with our AI and nuclear research fellows from the Council on Strategic Risks, together with our partners at the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. Today, we've got a fantastic set of speakers with us who will share more about the effect of AI on strategic stability and specifically on ballistic missile submarines. We put up this fellowship that is much more intensive than the usual kind of professional development fellowships because we really thought there was so much myth and more surface level discussions on the AI and nuclear intersection. In comparison, this fellowship is 10 months long. It tries to really focus on the research component and tries to equip experts on AI and experts on nuclear issues with a better understanding of the other domain. So we partner them with experts in the other field, and this is one of these products. I'm very proud of our fellows for coming up with fantastic research topics and questions that are really timely and contributing to policy discussions right now. We have more other reports or publications coming up from our other fellows. In total, we have 7 fellows with us from this past year. We hope to offer this fellowship again in the future for anyone who might be interested. It not only includes the research component, but it also includes professional development trips to the Bay Area, to the DC policy space, where they already engaged with policymakers and socialized their ideas. So these topics are already in some areas advanced in a way where we really made sure they got to speak with the stakeholders at the Pentagon, at the State Department, more directly, and also with more of the technical folks in the Bay Area. So very proud of this research team, and I'll hand it over back to Vivian to introduce our speakers.
Yeah, thanks, Jess, and welcome everyone. I'm Vivian, the Communications Manager at the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. We're really excited to present this webinar today, hosted jointly by the BRSL and by CSR. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please submit any questions you have for the speakers to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then towards the end, the speakers will get to answer some of those. We'll also be recording this webinar, so if you miss anything or have to step away, it'll be available on the BRSL website, hopefully by early next week. And then I'll just be introducing Dr. Lindsay Rand, who will be moderating today's discussion. She's a BRSL research scholar, and Lindsay completed her PhD at the University of Maryland, where her dissertation research looked at quantum technology implications for nuclear deterrence, including submarine detection. She has an article coming out later this month building on that research and evaluating quantum sensing implications for second strike capabilities. And now I'll hand things off to you, Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. So I'll be your moderator today, and we've got a really interesting discussion planned on the topic of AI implications for submarine vulnerability. I'll preface it with just saying this is an incredibly important and timely topic for those of us working on nuclear security, as the possibility of submarine vulnerability has really been invoked fairly frequently in recent academic and policy literature, though often the validity of these claims are not rigorously investigated and thus remain relatively unsupported. So to take a crack at getting to the bottom of that topic, today we'll have Dr. Barrett Schlegelmilch and Eliana Johns present the research they've completed for the AI Nuclear Fellowship, and specifically the research, which is now published in a report, which you can access online or we can drop into the chat, evaluates how different categories of AI enhancement could increase anti-submarine warfare platforms' abilities to detect ballistic missile submarines at varying depths and assesses the potential implications for strategic stability. So in addition to being an AI nuclear research fellow, Dr. Barrett Schlegelmilch is a technical program manager at Anthropic and a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy Reserves, a former nuclear submarine officer and an engineer at Blue Origin. His research interests include novel safety and hazard analysis methodologies. And in addition to being an AI nuclear research fellow, Eliana Johns is a senior research associate with the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, Eliana's research focuses on the use of open source methods to examine nuclear forces, strategic stability, and the intersections of emerging technology and security. And then we're also especially lucky to be joined by Dr. Eli Sanchez today, who's going to serve as our expert discussant in this conversation, given his own familiarity with the topic. Eli's at MIT, where he researches the potential for emerging technologies to increase the vulnerability of ballistic missile submarines. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor over to Eliana Barrett.
All right. Thank you, Lindsay. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Everyone see my screen okay? Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all for taking the time to join us here today. We're going to be talking about the potential impacts of AI in a few specific areas on the detectability and overall vulnerability of ballistic missile submarines. So our core research question that we set out to answer is how AI, as defined in three specific areas, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, may impact anti-submarine warfare platforms' abilities to better detect and ultimately hold at risk ballistic missile nuclear submarines, and what that could mean for potential strategic implications for various fleets. And our overall thesis is that the impacts that we are going to see in the near term over the next 5 years are going to be pretty asymmetric across these different fleets, and overall will be a function not just of the technologies themselves, but specifically the geographies and the operating doctrine of the platforms of the SSBNs, and how these platforms operate will be the overall determining factor, the overarching determining factor in their susceptibility to these enhancement areas. And so the possible implications of the answers to this question and what our research looked at is that some U.S. allies, depending on their operating doctrines and geography constraints, like UK or France, could face greater vulnerabilities from these enhancement areas. And certain strategies for SSBNs, like bastion strategies, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, could prove more favorable given geographic constraints of certain fleets. And overall, the research that we did shows that AI doesn't just dramatically improve any specific sensor necessarily. That the real enhancement or enablement areas are in things like sensor fusion and overall enablement of increased autonomy capabilities for things like UUVs. And ultimately, knowing or having a good idea of which areas may see the greatest impacts from these specific technology areas can help inform things like R&D and where we should be focusing potentially countermeasures down the line. So before we go into all of that and more on our methodology, I think it's good to just kind of level set with what we mean when we talk about detecting a submarine. And so this is a picture of a ballistic nuclear missile submarine. As you can see, the visual spectrum is not the greatest. Optical sensors are not the greatest for finding and tracking these platforms. The primary modality that tends to be used are things like sonar. There are other things like magnetic anomaly detection, but really sound is one of the primary methods that we use to locate these platforms. And what that actually looks like would be something like this, right? This is a visual representation of sound, and this is what's called a waterfall display, appropriately named, where the top of the display is more recent time, and the acoustic energy you see there will track down like a waterfall over time. So for this specific diagram, what we're looking at is a specific slice of a frequency spectrum, and the y-axis or the vertical axis is time, like I said, and the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is relative bearing of that energy. So the brighter parts are where there's more acoustic energy, and the darker parts are where there's less. So we're looking at like a relative bearing of different contacts there, and then those lines are moving as the sensor or the ship that has this display is itself maneuvering around. So it's not a very clear-cut thing to detect a submarine. It is really a chain of or a series of steps that incorporates a lot of different sensor types and data to try and form a overall picture of where this contact is, how fast it's moving, the direction of travel, and its range. So we're incorporating a lot of different pieces of data to ultimately get that picture. So it's a difficult, non-trivial problem to find a submarine. And for some more historical context on how we have tried to solve that problem and how we got to where we are today, there's been this kind of theme or discourse about the oceans becoming more transparent over time, and really you can trace this to the introduction of both new technologies, but just new ways of deploying those technologies over several decades, starting back in like the 1960s when, post World War II, we started to develop more platform-centric anti-submarine warfare capabilities. So think sensors that are, just deployed on a specific ship, like passive sonar sensors that are forming a picture of the world with just the data that they are able to collect themselves, to things like fixed acoustic arrays later on in the 1970s when things like SOSIS began to be deployed, which are fixed arrays of passive hydrophones on the seafloor that could detect things or submarines moving above them. And then kind of the next phase after that in the 80s was when we started to see more integration of the data from those various platforms. So integration of like fixed arrays and mobile arrays or mobile platforms. And then in the 2000s, we started to see uncrewed and autonomous vehicles and more distribution of these sensors as costs began to drop of producing them and deploying them. And what we think we're seeing now over the next over the next like 5 years especially is going to be a proliferation of that hardware, but also a much better capability or efficiency in incorporating the data from all of those various platforms through three specific areas of AI related enhancement. And we define those here as ML, machine learning, autonomy, and sensor fusion, which we'll talk about more in the next slide here as well. So overall, what we think is really driving a difference this time. We're not necessarily saying that the ocean is becoming transparent now, or that the stability of the nuclear triad is going to be shaken up in a real way here. I think SSBNs are still going to remain the most survivable leg of the nuclear triad for all the reasons that we just alluded to, and how difficult it is to form a clear picture of where they are. But the big drivers that we're seeing now are a pretty rapidly decreasing cost of producing high power density systems in very compute efficient hardware, and what that could mean for the proliferation of like swarms of UVs, for example, down the line, and pushing a lot of computation to the edge, like on platform, and everything that comes with just rapidly decreasing costs of manufacturing these things at scale. All that being said, the largest things that we think will continue to pace the ability of these platforms, anti-submarine warfare platforms, to actually carry out their mission and locate SSBNs is going to be the relative the geography and basic physical constraints of the ocean, and by extension, how the SSBN's different fleets themselves operate and where they operate. So to maybe give a little more detail to that, here is a picture of the home ports of the world's current ballistic missile submarines, and you can see from this very rough bathymetric chart that the different fleets have very different access levels to deep water. So starting on the left of the screen there, we have China with relatively constrained and shallow waters in the Yellow Sea, and then Russia up there in the north, which also is operating in a very relatively constrained waters that experiences a large amount of ice cover up in that latitude. And then in the middle here we have the U.S., which is unique in the fact that you have dual access at all times to deep water from both the West Coast and the East Coast there, without any relative geographic bottlenecks to actually reach those deep patrol waters. And then to the right there, the UK and France operating in kind of like a middle ground of relatively shallower or more constrained areas to get to those deeper patrol waters. And then India coming online and down there by the Bay of Bengal, which is kind of more towards towards like the China, the Russia geographic constraints of shallower, busier, more constrained waters. And so we see that these geographies themselves tend to shape the operating doctrines to a large degree of these fleets. And as we talk about here in the research, how these fleets ultimately will be more or less vulnerable to these enhancement areas over the next 5 years or so. So to bring some more rigor to how we actually answer this question, we developed a framework that, as I said, looks at AI specifically in these three subdomains. So machine learning, which we can think of machine learning as the enhancement potential on an individual sensor basis, very roughly. So looking at things like increasing the signal to noise ratio for a given sensor, and things like noise suppression overall. Autonomous systems, so what the technology can do to enable platforms like UVs to be more autonomous in their decision making and mission planning, and not just be executing a predefined set of steps and waypoints, and instead reacting to the in situ environment. And that is also enabled by things like better battery technology for more persistence. And then sensor fusion, which is just the broad area of how do we take in these very diverse and increasingly proliferating sensor sources, and create a clear map or understanding of what's happening under the water. And so those are the three lenses that we broke down the very broad term of AI into, and then we understood that geography has a very large impact in detectability for SSBNs. And so the way that we brought that into our analysis was splitting the water column into these three depth regimes, which very roughly follow the average inflection points of what's called a sound velocity profile. So if you look at a column of water, you can map how fast the sound travels as a function of depth in that water, and inflection points delineate where sound can be trapped in ducts. So you can kind of think of the water column in these three rough depth regimes as three areas in which sound is relatively isolated. So that's the how we brought geography into the analysis, and then uh, our overall analysis is looking tried to break this down into more or less of a binary. Can you detect a SSBN or not? And try to go into more nuance in what we define as an ASW detection chain, starting from like the easiest or the roughest thing that you do, which is searching, just identifying whether a contact exists in a given patch of water, to localizing it, to then ultimately getting enough data and resolution of that data to classify like what the specific platform is, whether, even down to the specific submarine type, and then tracking, which is when you have enough data, enough fidelity of it to have a very high confidence solution of that contact's course, range, speed, in order to confidently trail it without counter detection or ultimately potentially place a weapon on the target. And so using those broad categorizations of how we define AI, how we consider geography in terms of the water depth regimes, and what portions of the ASW detection chain we're looking at, we assessed how those three AI enhancement areas would affect 10 representative platforms that we chose, just to provide a range of platforms from submarine, both crewed and autonomous vehicles, to surface ships, both crewed and autonomous, helicopters, fixed wing and drones, and also a low Earth orbit constellation. And we looked at their potential enhancements from those three AI regimes across the three depth areas that I talked about, and looked at how they could impact each portion of that detection chain. Using open source materials, we went and derived a qualitative impact score, 0 to 3, that also had an associated confidence level, which was based on how many corroborating open source pieces of evidence we could find to support it, whether or not they agreed, and the overall like reputability of the source, whether it was a first party source, directly from the government report or from a prime contractor working on that platform, for example, would be a higher confidence source. And aggregating all those scores across each platform, each enhancement area, and each depth regime allowed us to get a quantitative number based on this qualitative analysis, of course, on how those platforms would be most impacted in each depth regime. And then using that information, we were then able to go and make some assertions about how different fleets would be impacted, and what the potential implications for those impacts would be. And to talk about that next part in our results, I'll turn it over to partner Eliana.
Great, thanks so much. So we realized that the heat map doesn't really show the heat on this slide, but if you look at the report, you'll be able to see more of the colored differences that I'll be referencing. So this is meant to be a heat map. It's the same chart that you'll see in our report, but we used this as a method to visualize our findings, where each of the values aggregate our scores across the three AI categories and the four detection chain segments, as Barrett mentioned. So in the report, there will be a darker shade of red that indicates more of a higher impact, whereas the lighter shade, more of like a yellow, is the medium impact, and then the blue indicates a low to no impact. And then you'll also see the averaged confidence scores visible there to show overall medium confidence aggregated across these platforms. And so the highest score that we could have given any platform would have been 36, which means that it would have scored a transformative 3 in all of the AI categories and across every phase of the detection chain. This didn't happen. As you can see, the highest we got was, I believe, 28. But there were several platforms that scored well above 20, which we had deemed to be a significant uplift from AI. So before we jump into the patterns and analysis of these ratings that you can see here, I'll just add a few notes about our approach. So as Barrett kind of mentioned as well, some countries around the world do operate different combinations of these platforms and others don't. So we just chose these 10 because they spanned the relevant depth regimes we wanted to examine and because they are US systems for the most part. I think we took a look distinctly at ICEYE as a SAR constellation, but the idea is that we would be able to access enough open source information that could be accessible for our research purposes. Another thing I'll add is that we accounted for physics and proliferation constraints in these ratings, as well as things like launch platform accessibility. So a few examples of that are like the need for shore-based operating bases for the Poseidon, or things like latency in delivery with synthetic aperture radar. Something else to consider is that these scores only focus on the detection part of the problem. So we didn't incorporate existing or future things like SSBN sound silencing or counter detection methods that could improve at a comparable pace to what we were examining as far as AI enhancements. And that could potentially offset some of these gains. So we didn't focus on any of that counter detection stuff either. And then, as Barrett mentioned as well, these numbers aren't supposed to be static units. They're meant to be more reflective of the range of impact and where some of the hotspots might lie. And the same goes with the associated confidence measures. They're kind of meant to help identify areas of priority or potential strengths and weaknesses, and also just help identify where future research can be done. So the numbers you'll be able to see where some of the emphasis might lie in our analysis, even if you don't see the colors. But really, the idea of the heat map is not to give you like a static unit. So with these things in mind, there are a few patterns that stand out. So if you could go to the next slide. Um, the first addresses this depth component. So the highest AI impact, as again Barrett mentioned, we found occurs at shallow depths, and that's reflected in the left column there, where the machine learning category primarily drove impact at this depth because it could enhance signal processing and pattern recognition, which improves extraction of a contact signal from background noise. And that's really consequential for operating in shallow water where ambient noise levels are elevated by surface traffic or other environmental conditions. And then at the more extreme depths, physics and acoustic propagation remain just major constraints, even with AI enhancement. And acoustic detection becomes really primarily the viable mechanism. So most of the platforms either can't operate or sustain sensor deployment at those depths. So the second pattern to note here too is that of the three AI categories, machine learning consistently scored the highest, whereas autonomy scored the lowest. And this was just because ML applies to nearly every sensor type that we looked at, and it's also already maturing into operational systems. Sensor fusion contributed primarily at the localization phase of the detection chain, where correlating separate sensors can help narrow down a contact's position. And it also holds up pretty well for platforms that might be carrying multiple sensor types. So autonomy, on the other hand, did force some difficult trade-offs between payload and fuel source, which makes endurance still a central limitation. And there's constraints when it comes to communications capabilities and the host platforms that these systems have to operate from. You could also imagine unresolved legal and doctrinal questions around unmanned platforms in a nuclear adjacent mission. Then the third pattern here that we were observing is the crude submarines, where we focused on the Virginia class, but overall they did retain the greatest potential across all of the depth regimes, where they are also the dominant platform at extreme depths. And we found that really AI enhances what these submarine platforms can already do. The advantages are really primary from the onboard processing capacity and operational reach that is unique to a submarine versus some of the other platforms. And so the other platforms that do gain some AI uplift at extreme depths, so I'll just like on the chart here, it's UUVs and rotary wing aircraft, fixed acoustic arrays. They're equipped with acoustic sensors that can be positioned below the thermocline. So at the opposite end, though, are platforms that depend on the non-acoustic sensors. So SAR satellites are, a great example of that, where they just can't operate at those depths. Across the board, we really observed that AI doesn't resolve many of the underlying physical constraints of ASW platforms, whether that's fuel and energy expenditure or platform proliferation, just the size of the ocean. It can, however, optimize how platforms use limited resources, which really stood out as a benefit. And it's also possible that complementary hardware advances like next generation systems could gradually erode some of those limitations as well in the future. So these findings suggest specific platforms are worth deeper investigation, and they set up a lot of broader questions that we tried to address in our paper about what this could all mean for strategic stability and what some of the other implications are. So you can go to the next slide there. So our central finding that AI enhancement is most concentrated in these shallow depths is, but it has asymmetric consequences for nuclear armed states that are determined primarily by geography and operating doctrine. And that's because, as Barrett mentioned, the different nuclear armed states operate in different geographies. The United States has direct access to the open ocean. Russia and China are limited by their geographic constraints. China in particular, as well as India, but India's capabilities are more nascent than China. But historically, China has been limited by the range of their submarine-launched ballistic missiles, as well as the higher acoustic signature of their Jin-class boats. So these countries have relied on bastion strategies which is different than what the United States does. And the United Kingdom and France also face a challenge where, without protected waters that are large enough to sustain a bastion, they have to transit shallow, constrained waters to reach the deep water patrol areas. And that's exactly where we determined AI-enhanced detection to be the strongest. So because of this, geography issue, we were really thinking that states might prioritize different ASW platforms based on their comparative advantage. So a country surrounded by shallow waters might invest more in platforms aimed at detecting an adversary attack submarine at those depths in its nearby regions. And a country with that geography or with also limited resources to spend on exquisite attack submarine capabilities might find that cheaper platforms are probably more viable investments, especially since they can be enhanced by AI. And notably, those are the same platforms that could also protect that state's own SSBNs operating in those waters. Additionally, states with a stronger capacity to integrate the technology will be able to apply it more effectively. And states that already possess advanced capabilities are unlikely to see gains that are as dramatic as those that are available to states starting from a different baseline. So AI integration could yield disproportionately larger improvements for states that are kind of coming from that lower baseline. And then on a broader scale, states just with more vulnerable SSBN fleets can hedge potentially, by prioritizing other kinds of survivable second strike capabilities, especially if they're willing to accept less of a presence. That's probably, much further down the line. But it's really important to emphasize overall that these AI advantages accrue to both hiders and seekers. So both the submarine trying to stay concealed and the platforms that are trying to find it. However, the enhancements don't overturn the structural advantage that hiders have long retained. So another element that we considered is where geography allows, just that AI enhancement could reinforce bastion operations in shallow waters where AI enhanced detection performs the best. A defending navy can layer these different systems more cheaply. And so for Russia and China in particular, that could mean their ability to protect SSBNs already operating in bastions might improve alongside these AI capabilities. And because this vulnerability falls unevenly across different fleets, as we've discussed, it strengthens the case for a more coordinated rather than a purely national approach to SSBN survivability. So if we're thinking in terms of the United States, cooperating with the UK and France, or British and French cooperation, the UK and France are most exposed during their transit phases. So maintaining a credible continuous at-sea deterrence posture will increasingly depend on sharing sensor coverage, escort tasking, delousing operations, all these things to be able to complicate tracking in the face of these AI enhancements. And finally, even if AI doesn't actually close the detection gap as dramatically as feared, especially considering potential counter detection capabilities, the perception that it might could be destabilizing enough on its own. So a state that overestimates an adversary's ability to find its SSBNs might shift towards a more aggressive launch posture, while a state that overestimates its own survivability may take greater risks in a crisis. And both of those forms of perception carry significant escalation risk, even if it's not the case that these, detection is actually possible. So, I'll go to the next slide here too, just to kind of wrap up a little bit, because so that's what we talk a lot about in the report, and then we also raise, just further questions and opportunities for further research and discussion. So we mentioned like this question of ally patrol areas or force structures potentially being coordinated as vulnerability becomes asymmetric. We mentioned that autonomous ASW platforms are not considered in arms control initiatives right now. So could they be treated differently? Could they be incorporated in the future? And then also, what we ask questions like, what currently are some hardware constrained technologies that warrant close monitoring as potential future disruptors? And overall, as I've kind of mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity here to test the framework that we've introduced and to think about what future strategies could look like in a world with increasingly advanced technology, and further explore what some of those counter detection capabilities could be. Maybe they're cheaper than what some of these AI enhancements are. There's really a lot that can be done with this kind of work. So I'll leave it at that. I know it was a little bit long, so sorry about that. But we really appreciate your time and look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Eliana and Barrett. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Eli to bring him into this discussion. Eli, we'd welcome your response to any aspects of Barrett and Eliana's report, but I also want to tie in some of your own research findings as well. And I'll drop because I know you have a recent publication out this week, and I'll drop that into the chat. But your research looks at how emerging technologies, and particularly AI, could affect SSBN vulnerability, which is obviously very much aligned with this report. So I'm interested to know, in addition to your overarching feedback, of the three categories of AI that Eliana and Barrett identify, machine learning, autonomy, and sensor fusion, well, first, do those categories comport with how you assess AI implications for SSBN vulnerability? And just out of curiosity, which do you think will have the largest impact on ASW in the next several years?
Cool. Thanks, Lindsay. And just checking, can you hear me? Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And, so I think one of the things that I really appreciated about Barrett and Eliana's paper is that it kind of looks at this emerging technology question in a lot of granularity, looking at the sort of context, the type of systems, and then the different SSBN operating strategies, and asks what could be the impact in sort of different contexts. And so to answer your question, I think that the effect of emerging technologies on SSBN survivability is probably going to be very context specific, and which technologies help or will have the greatest impact will depend a lot. So for example, Eliana was talking about bastion strategies. I think that my understanding is that countries who such as Russia and China, who are less confident in the ability of their SSBNs to evade detection, will use bastion strategies as kind of a way to mitigate that vulnerability by protecting them with friendly forces. And I think that that's a very different, finding and targeting those SSBNs that operate in that way is a very different problem than targeting SSBNs that operate in the open ocean, like the U.S. fleet does, and which are very, very quiet. So I find the argument that autonomy and improved sensor capabilities will be very effective in protecting SSBNs and bastions very compelling. Just because, in your home turf, I think it's much easier to deploy, these systems kind of in numbers. The endurance of uncrewed vehicles is very limited. And so I think the ability to use them, again, in your home waters is much easier than kind of deploying them far from your home waters, like the U.S. would have to do to target SSBNs that are operating in Russia's and China's bastions. But then, so I think that could be one of the most interesting technologies in that context. But then against U.S. SSBNs, I think detection is the limiting challenge. They're very, very quiet. They operate in immense patrol areas, and I think the problem that U.S. adversaries run into is they can't find them at all. And I think in that case, sensing, again, this is my intuition. I don't know for sure, but I think that improved sensing is probably the most interesting, potential, disruption that emerging technology, could introduce. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I love things coming back to sensing, so that's great. I will use the speaker's prerogative to just quickly ask actually each of you, so Eliana and Barrett a question, and Eli, I think this question is actually appropriate for you as well. And then I know there's a couple of questions in the chat, but if you have questions, drop them in, and as they answer, I will still try to prioritize and see if I can lump them together. So one of the key challenges with evaluating submarine vulnerability to really anything, but also emerging technologies, is classification of information and using open source data. And so I think actually what's really cool about each of the people on this call is that you all approach open source information both with a certain level of expertise and also, a unique perspective that I think allows you to get into and then really qualify the information you're working with better. So perhaps each of you could just give your own perspective on sort of the limits, but also opportunities of using open source to answer questions like, will AI impact submarine vulnerability? So Eliana, for example, given that FAS, your organization, really is, broadly leverages open source to progress dialogue, I know you are acutely aware of both limits and opportunities in nuclear analysis and in progressing nuclear discussions. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why we shouldn't just discredit open source analysis or the value you see in that brings to the field. And then Barrett, given that you actually have a background as a submariner, which is so unique, Perhaps you could talk about how you use that to read open source literature on ASW and AI to give you a little bit more of a unique perspective. And then Eli, you actually bring a third perspective, which is the technical analysis angle, which has long been a way that experts have circumvented classification on issues like submarine detection. So for you, maybe the question would be how you were able to leverage physics and technical analysis to get around the classification issues, and then what you think the major parameters, or if there are major parameters, that could undermine your analysis if you were to have access to classified information. So really, I'm just trying to see what you all think about this question of, can we actually progress this analysis in the open source, which I hope the answer is yes, and what you think the challenges and opportunities of that are.
Yeah, I can hop in first. I absolutely love this question. Thank you so much for posing it. I think when it comes to nuclear weapons issues in general, but SSBNs and, future capabilities in general, there will always be limitations, and rightfully so, to what you can access in the open source. However, this is actually a really interesting example of an issue that you can find a lot of, information on. Maybe it's not the most precise or accurate information out there, but you can still find a lot of details and kind of piece together a really rather complete picture. And that's for a couple of reasons. So one, the United States and Russia have been operating SSBNs for a really long time. And so over the decades of, technology changes, of transparency measures, of arms control data exchange, you have it. We just have, a pretty substantial history and a lot of research to serve as a foundation for the work that we do today and that we will be doing in the future. Additionally, when it comes to AI, it's definitely not new by any means, but you have a lot of commercial involvement in this particular kind of technology, which means that companies are trying to, advertise, or they're trying to explain what they're working on or explain the systems that they're using, any breakthroughs. And that does also provide, a unique kind of source of information that is completely open source, that colors in a lot of the details that you might be looking for. To your question about why we shouldn't discard open source and what the value is that it brings to the field, I think, maybe this report is just one example of many where there is a lot that you can piece together when it comes to what's available in the open source. We're not trying to expose anything or, uncover any secrets, but we are trying to add some nuance to the public debate. So by bringing together a variety of sources, a variety of backgrounds and perspectives, we can support the public and whether it's researchers, journalists, even like, government or government officials, whether they want to be able to talk about this stuff in public. Our work is aimed at supporting those kinds of conversations, and helping the public and government to government relations to engage more on this stuff that, as you mentioned, is really timely and really important and surfacing a lot of these important discussions around the role of SSBNs, the role that AI will play in, the future of risks and things like that. So, yeah, thanks again for the question.
Cool. Yeah, and I'll just say I learned a ton about just the power of open source research from Eliana, and the amount of things that you can derive from open source data is pretty incredible. I think like as Eli knows very well, like a lot of this is a a modelable physics problem that you like there is a lot of data on just public data on bathymetry and environmental data, and you can figure out like detection thresholds like pretty trivially for a given geometry. But a lot of the nuance maybe at higher classification levels comes down to things like operating doctrine, like specific tonals that you can exploit, things like that. So what I think that the gap maybe in the current open source literature that we try to like bring a little bit of unclassified nuance to is framing this in more of like the ASW detection chain standpoint of not treating detection as like a binary event and trying to bring more nuance to the like how these technology areas can enhance the specific parts that go into uh, tracking and ultimately holding at risk an SSBN. So yeah, it was a great learning experience for me.
Yeah, I liked what Eliana and Barrett had to say. I don't have a lot to add. I think on the value of the open source analysis, I think one thing I might say that I've come to appreciate as I've worked on this is that I think it is the case that specialists with classified knowledge can probably do significantly more accurate analyses of these issues. I think, one, informing the public debate, like Eliana said, I think is very important. But also, I think that people who do this kind of analysis have a different skill set. I think informing, people who think about policy at a very high level, I think can bring a different perspective to the table than people who are very narrowly focused, on the sort of technical nitty gritty, which I think is a lot of what is going on in classified spaces, and sort of ask questions like, is this a good idea? Is it going to be really expensive? The kinds of questions that I think the debate about what we should do and why and how much money we should spend on it, all those kinds of things that matter to the public. I think that is a perspective that unclassified research really helps with. And then on kind of approaching analysis itself, I liked what Barrett had to say. I think I would just say one kind of rule of thumb that I have found useful is that I think that in doing this kind of analysis, physics, I think is something that anytime the question is related to physics, I think that there's a lot you can do and a lot you can say. And I think the trouble really comes down to engineering, like how good are the systems actually, how quiet are the submarines, how well do the AI models perform, things like that. And you can find indicators in the unclassified domain, but I think that is the domain in which I found myself just having to caveat, like I've made this assumption, maybe try to bound the problem with a lower and an upper bound, things like that. But the paper on sensing that I recently published, I think benefited from primarily dealing with physics, but there is some engineering in there. And there I've just had to sort of rely on unclassified proxies and sort of caveat my analysis and my conclusions as honestly as I can.
Great, thank you. And okay, so I will try to ask four questions in rapid fire and try to lump them together, and then we'll just go slightly over, and you guys can each kind of tackle which ones you think fit for your work. So this one's more specific for the report for Barrett and Eliana. We have a question asking for clarification of ASW implications in busy waters. So one participant observes that, as you mentioned, India is constrained by surrounding busier waters. Does busier obfuscate the sounds of SSBNs? And will AI be good at distinguishing SSBN noises from commercial noises? Or does that busier also mean there are more sensors, et cetera, more chances of detection? We have a methodology, I would say methodology and data question, which is what role, if any, do you think wargaming could play in advancing your research? So maybe this is another angle for open source analysis on the topic. Does anybody have any thoughts about wargaming? And then we have a couple of questions on, I guess, broader picture adaptability and strategy implications. So how confident are you that SSBN capabilities and operational concepts will continue to adapt, allowing them to remain a survivable and relevant component of nuclear forces over the next 5 to 10 years? And then more broadly, what would the evolution of AI-enhanced ASW mean for the traditional logic of nuclear deterrence and assured second strike capability? And so maybe, Eli, you can jump in on that one too, because I know that's a core discussion point in your paper. Sorry, just trying to knock them all out before we have to jump off.
I could take a crack at the first one on the busy waters. Yeah, it's a great question. I think that most commercial shipping traffic tends to emit noise like in a specific band. So if I had to take a rough guess at like the overall impact, I think that better noise suppression or better filtering capabilities are going to create a net increase in detectability for boats operating in those waters. Like even right now, if you know that the broad noise that you're dealing with is in a specific band, it's relatively easy to filter out. So I think that'll get easier in the future. And noisy environments, the other thing I'd say is noisy environments are not optimal for both the contact and the platform that is seeking the contact. So yeah, it's not beneficial necessarily for either of them.
Yeah, I can hop in on the second question about wargaming. Um, I've I've found wargaming to be really useful for several areas, but two of which that really come to mind for this particular issue. One, getting people in a room with really varied levels of expertise. So I benefited a lot from Barrett's expertise and learning so much from him as somebody who doesn't come from a technical background. And so getting people in a room together to discuss from a policy perspective, strategic, physics, engineering, naval warfare officer, and then, or even like um, different countries to come together to offer their own understanding of a certain issue, that's always incredibly valuable just to get people in a room to look at a problem from different perspectives. Um, Additionally, I think the element that I brought up of potential misperceptions could really benefit from wargaming or doing kind of scenario exercises around different levels of information that someone might have access to, or how different situations might, uh, you know, compel different responses depending on what you think you have an ability to do versus what you think your adversary has an ability to do, and then also in cooperation with like people representing other countries or different yeah, military branches. So there could be a lot of potential for wargaming to definitely, expose some more of these either information gaps that we discussed or kind of address some of the research questions that we brought up in our paper as well.
Okay, and I'll take the confidence in SSBN survivability and deterrence question, like Lindsay suggested. I think the question of what is necessary for deterrence is a whole can of worms, as I think many people in this audience probably appreciate. And I'll kind of set that aside, but I'll just say that I think often in the debate about SSBN vulnerability, a point that I'm sure people are aware of, but that isn't really made, is that nuclear weapons are incredibly destructive. And to, I think, to truly undermine deterrence, I think you have to be able to target SSBNs with very, very high confidence. And I mean, my understanding is that most modern SSBNs carry anywhere between 12 to 20 missiles that can be MIRVed. But one SSBN has a lot of firepower. So if you're a policymaker, if you're a decision maker, sorry, thinking about launching an attack against an adversary's nuclear arsenal, I mean, my view is failing to destroy one SSBN within a reasonable time frame would give you a lot of pause. That's a very simplistic picture. But I think it kind of illustrates the key point that, perhaps it is the case that emerging technologies are making it easier to target SSBNs. And I think it will depend on a lot of things, like Barrett and Eliane have talked about, the type of operating strategy that they use and a number of other factors. But I think I would just say the bar is very, very high for undermining deterrence. And I just, my view from my work is that even if emerging technologies are sort of moving us in the direction of making SSBNs more targetable, I don't think it's the sort of like revolutionary breakthrough kind of. It's likely to be that sort of thing. I think that given how confident, how reliable your targeting would need to be, I just think that the capability to do that is so far away, and I personally don't worry that deterrence is going anywhere.
Great. Thank you all. You actually each answered all those questions, so that was great. Well, I'm getting the push now from our communications manager that we're at time. So I will just end by saying in the chat, you should all have received messages from me with a link to the report. So definitely go and read, and they have a lot of useful graphics and charts, and also an appendix that is very thorough. So you can read more there. And then I've also dropped a link to Eli's new publication as well. So hopefully everyone has a nice evening reading about submarine detection, and thank you all for joining us.